start with a personal story. Before I went to the Masters of Applied Positive Psychology program at the University of Pennsylvania, I was a software engineer for IBM. In the 26 years I worked for IBM, I had jobs where I hated getting up out of bed in the morning and I really didn't want to go to work. And I had to force myself. And I had jobs where I would wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning having a hard time keeping myself in bed because I wanted to get up and get to my computer and get going again. So let me just ask you for a second, how many of you have had the first kind of experience, the can hardly get out of bed in the morning? Okay? So usually people have had some kind of experience like that. How about the second, the experience of just being so involved in what you're doing that you could almost not stay away from it? Okay. So you've had both. Okay. So think about the difference for just a second. My sense of the difference, or let me tell a story about a particular time when I was really, really involved. I was the team leader for a development team that was building an application that would take web content and transform it so that people could look at it on their cell phones and their PDAs. This was back in 1999, 2000, so we're a little bit ahead of the curve. It seems kind of normal today that people can do that, but at the time, everybody thought we were crazy. But we were having a ball. We got to, with everybody, we had about 50, 60 people. We had testers, we had developers, we had people who were translating into 9 different languages. We had people who were writing publications, and everybody could picture somebody walking around and being able to pull out their phone and check on the traffic in their hometown, or be able to look at their email and do a quick answer. And at the time, the sense of being able to contribute to people using the web on the go was really, really exciting. I actually meant to bring a prop with me because we named this project Content Magic, and we came within 3 weeks of actually shipping the product with that name before the name police caught up with us. So when I left the project as the team leader after 2 or 3 releases, people gave me a top hat because we called it Content Magic, and so we felt like we were pulling magic out of a hat. And I meant to bring the top hat with me and just flip it open so that you could see, but forgot it. So looking back on this project, I was trying to figure out what made it such a magical project. What made it something where people were so excited about working on it? And one of the things that I believe contributed to it was that we not only individually felt like we had a purpose at work, we had a shared purpose. We had a purpose that everybody in the group could participate in and felt drawn together by. So what I'd like to talk about today is purpose, not as an individual thing, but as a shared thing, as something that can bring a work group together. So I'm going to tell 3 stories. I've already told one. I'm going to tell this one and then one more. And then I'm going to talk about some tools, some models that I think are useful for thinking about meaning at work, and some tools that I think can be used with a work group to help people come to a sense of shared meaning. So my second story is the tale of 2 barista jobs. It's actually a story of a young woman in my town who had a job for one of these chains, like Starbucks, similar to Starbucks, but not Starbucks. And then as a barista, where she was making fancy coffee. And then after about 6 months, she got the same job as a barista working in a local cooperative grocery store. So same job, making coffee drinks, different environment. When I asked her, well, what did you feel was the purpose of your work at the first place, the chain? She said, well, I felt like the purpose of my work was to make money for a struggling business, because in this particular town, that business was struggling. And she said, and the way I had to do it was to try and push calories on people. Now, this young woman is actually taking the prereqs to become a nurse, so her feeling was that trying to push unnecessary calories on people in order to make money for the company, you can sort of see that didn't work for her. When she went to work for the local grocery store, it was still a question of making money, but it was to make money to keep this local business that brought fresh produce from local farmers to the market, that was a meeting place for people in the whole town. She felt she was doing the same work, making coffee drinks. It was still stressful. It was still tedious. But her feeling about the job was completely different. And so I tell that story partly to make the point that it isn't necessarily the work itself. The work was the same in these two situations. It's the work and the context and the purpose and how you interpret it. So my final story before I really get into the models and things, when I was starting to think about coming to talk here, I looked for, I write articles for an online publication called Positive Psychology News Daily. So I thought, I write an article every month, and if you're interested, I can tell you how to subscribe to it. So I thought, I'll go out and look for evidence of meaning as a shared thing in particular environments. And I found the story of Interface Inc. How many of you have heard of Interface Inc? Okay. Interface Inc. makes modular carpets. So if you look at a modular carpet or the kinds of carpets that are like 8 by 8 squares, and people put them down and they sort of are glued together well enough at the boundaries that it looks like one big carpet, but it's a little easier to install. The Interface Inc. and making carpets, by the way, is a very resource-intense job. It uses up a lot of petrochemicals, et cetera. In 1994, a group of customers started asking Interface Inc. They started asking, what are you doing for the environment? And customers, I mean, the people working there started looking at that and thought to themselves, what are we doing for the environment? And when they looked around, what they figured out was not very much. In other words, they were using up a lot of petrochemicals, and as people pulled up their carpets, they were creating a lot of landfill. So they were causing a lot of damage to the environment. So people within the company decided to have a task force to figure out a better answer for their customers about what they were doing for the environment. They went to the CEO, Ray Anderson, and said, would you give the kickoff speech for this task force? He really didn't want to give that speech because he realized he didn't have anything to say. So in the course of thinking about it and preparing to give the talk, he read a book whose name just went right out of my mind, but I can certainly make sure it's in the presentation if people would like to have it. He read a book that basically made him see that they were plunderers of the environment. So he went and gave a speech to this particular task force and then charged the task force to set a clear and elevating goal. And what they came up with was to have Interface Inc. over the course, between 1995 and 2020, change the way they did business such that they took nothing, such that they used only easily reproducible materials, which was a very, very difficult goal. So over the course of they've made a tremendous amount of progress. And so if you go out and look on the web for Interface Inc., you can find descriptions of what they've done, the kinds of things how much they've reduced the waste they produce. They came up with ideas, for example, that instead of selling people modular carpet, they lease it to them, right? Now think about recycling. One of the big problems of recycling is where do you get the things that you're going to recycle? So with this idea of leasing, what they accomplished was instead of going and hauling old bits of carpet out of landfills, that they could lease the carpet squares to people when they got tired of the color or it got stained or they just wanted to change it for any reason. They could send it back to Interface Inc. Interface Inc. could then run it through their recycling process and then send it back out again. So many ideas, innovative ideas came out of the people in the company, and they've made a tremendous amount of progress in terms of reducing their consumption, how much they're actually taking from the environment. As the CEO puts it, and you can find numerous YouTube clips of Ray Anderson talking about this process if you go out and Google it. But one of the points that he made was that he realized that they were plunderers, that they had a plundering business model. And he felt once he became aware of it, that this was something that had to change. So here you have an elevating purpose, a big purpose that is, people would look at that and say, how could we do this by the year 2020? And that purpose has been a sense of, has caused a great deal of employee engagement. It's caused people to get really excited about what they do. They're still putting carpet on the floor. I mean, one of their purposes is to put carpet on the floor, but another part of their purpose is how they put the carpet on the floor. And finally, that they can serve as an existence proof for other companies that this can be done, that business can find a way of operating where they aren't plundering the environment. So this is a very unifying concept. So, stories. Oh, when I did a dry run of this with some people who said, you really ought to tell people what you're going to tell them, and then tell them what you told them. So this is my telling you what I'm going to tell you, right? First of all, that there's a power to purpose when it's shared. It's not just something that people have by themselves. And it takes some work to get people in a group to actually figure out what is the purpose we share. And sometimes it takes some work to help people figure out how to phrase it in a way that they can actually remember it and so that it can drive what they do. Second, purpose plus understanding equals meaning. I often hear people talk about what's the difference between purpose and understanding, and I'll show you a picture of Steger and Dick's model, which is where I got this from. There are intentional ways to explore purpose in a group with the goal of coming up with something that is easy to remember, but that can still be inspiring to people. People experience meaning differently, and understanding this is important in terms of working with a group, and I'll go through that. And finally, I hope we have time. I've done a lot of work on motivation, and one of the facets of motivation is whether or not people experience their work as purposeful and meaningful. And so I've got a sort of a tool that I use to help people go through and figure out, do I have meaning in my work? And if not, are there ways that I could increase it? So these are the things I'm going to do today: stories, models, and tools. Am I talking too fast? Okay. Here is something that I took out of the Oxford Handbook of Positive Psychology at Work, an article by Steger and Dick. And this is their breakdown of work as meaning, that it's actually a combination not just of work, the purposefulness of work, but also the comprehension of the purpose and how the person fits into the purpose. So your organization can have a great purpose statement, but if people can't understand it, if people can't remember it, if people have no sense of how they fit into it, it's not effective. So the two of these together create the overall sense of purpose, of meaning at work. So fitting into the organization. When I asked Michael Steger if I could use this picture, and he said, please use the whole thing. And I really wanted to basically show the work comprehension and the work purpose, and that those two link together for meaning. So I'm not going to go through the bottom line, but it is all there, and you can see the article that they have printed in that book. Now, I'm going to read you these two statements. Anybody who works with organizations and is trying to convince them that having a positive workplace would actually benefit the business bottom line, this is a great resource. It's called Engaging for Success, Enhancing Performance Through Employee Engagement. It was commissioned by the United Kingdom government and if you'd like to have a copy of the slides, you can ask and I'll send them to you. It's about a 70 or 80 page report that has a lot of information from different companies about engagement. It was commissioned by the UK government as a way of exploring what engagement was like in the UK and thinking about it in terms of making UK businesses competitive in the rest of the world. There's one section in this book where they've described 4 different things to increase engagement, and 2 of them are listed here. But I particularly like, and so I'm going to read it out loud. Okay. The narrative, the leadership, and the quotation here is to have a narrative is clearly expressed story about what the purpose of an organization is, why it has the broad vision it has, and how an individual contributes to the purpose. Employees have a clear line of sight between their job and the narrative. So you can see here there is both the purpose and the understanding. So the clear line of sight that everybody who's working in the company can see, how does my work contribute to the purpose? Plus, they can remember what the purpose is because it's a clear narrative. One of my favorite examples of this, I learned from an organization development person back when I worked at IBM, who told us about Coca-Cola at one point, had a statement, we put a refreshing drink within arm's reach of everyone on the planet. Now that is a statement, and having worked for IBM, I've read many, multiple page mission statements about what it is that we do. But think of this particular sentence. I heard that probably 5 years ago. It's stuck in my head. I can remember it. It's clear, simple, and memorable. Plus, anybody in Coca-Cola can line up and point and say, what am I doing? I'm putting crates of drinks on a truck. Hey, I'm getting drinks within arm's reach of everybody on the planet. Or they can say, I'm working on the recipe for Coke in Saudi Arabia. Well, this is someplace on the planet. I'm giving them what they consider a refreshing drink. This is an example of a purpose statement that can be very much of a driver for people. So the second of the four, and there are two others that I'm not going to talk about today, but I recommend if you're interested in employee engagement and how to make a workplace more inviting, to look at it. Most organizations have espoused values and all have behavioral norms. Where there is a gap between the two, the size of the gap is reflected in the degree of distrust within the organization. If the gap is closed, high levels of trust usually result. I was participating this morning in the session that you were leading where you're talking about the baby boomers, and there was a lot of sense in the room of distrust in the organization. And I think of that as being the gap between what companies say they do and what they actually do. In some cases, what they say they do, you still wouldn't want, but at least you'd feel like they'd be honest. But the gap creates a sense of distrust and a sense, I think entitlement sometimes comes when people feel like you've broken your side of the bargain. I'm not getting what I contracted for. So that could be something that relates there. So anyway, this is one tool. If you're working with organizations, this particular report is something that I would definitely recommend. The next tool that I have here is something that came out of some work that I did when I was working for IBM. When you have, there's a line that what gets measured gets managed. And if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. But what happens if you have something that is subjective? It's not just counting how many widgets come off of the assembly line. If there's something that you want to improve. Now, this approach that we're using started when we were working on usability. So how could we make our products easier for our customers to install, to run, to maintain, to keep going? And there were about 30 or 40 different elements that were written up like this, where we could say, okay, our program is easy to install. And then we would put down a list of these are particular things that are the characteristics of programs that are easy to install. Different groups would take these and evaluate themselves. And you might say, well, everybody give themselves straight A's, but that's not what happened. People actually would give an honest, you get a group of people together and they'd come up with an honest evaluation. Once you've got an evaluation, then you've got something that you can come back to later and then measure yourself to see, have we changed anything? Have we made any particular progress? So this actually comes from 4 different questions, 4 different qualities actually that we were measuring. Number one was, do we use the time of our people well? Number 2 was, do we use the energy, do we manage the energy of our people well? Number 3 was, do we have a shared and valued purpose? And number 4 was, do we develop our people well? So that was a set of questions that we could evaluate like this to help a particular group set goals and then be able to, once you get a baseline, then you can measure yourself against it later. So you can see that, if I will, rather than reading these out loud, I'm going to take a deep breath and actually reach for my water. If somebody would give it to me, I'll take a drink, and then I will see if you have any questions about them. Any questions or thoughts? Can you imagine answering these questions about your organization? Go ahead.
So how did you go about using this tool? Is this something where people would do this in a group and then discuss their answers, or where they submitted and you sort of tally things up and then released a report, or how did that work?
The way we did it was to have people in a group discuss these. Yeah. Okay, and what happens when you have this kind of question, it's a little bit like the Gallup questions for engagement. The questions suggest actions. So if you can look at this and you say, do you have a defined purpose that people can remember? If the answer is no, there's an action that this suggests that you might want to try. I'm going to put the bottle of water down and see if I can get to the end of the session without kicking it over. So we will get to some of these things as we go later. That there are, the last one, for example, people in the group experience meaning by helping others succeed is related to a discussion that I'll get into in a few minutes about different ways that people experience meaning. But there are organizations where people are not encouraged or are actively discouraged from making each other successful. So this is an area where you can do some evaluation and see, is this something that characterizes this particular group? And once again, you can have the questions if you're interested. So these are a set of questions. This is another tool that I've used. These are a set of questions that you can use to help a group brainstorm their way to what is their shared and valued purpose. And one of the things that Cameron and Quinn suggest is that you get people to start out with very concrete stories, with metaphors, real-life examples, or as one of the people suggested when I went through this in a dry run, talk to your customers. Ask your customers, what difference do we make in your lives? Get customers to come in and tell stories is another way of going about this. So very, very specific questions. Moving from the specific then, once you've collected stories, once people have thought of these, then you can start working towards, well, what's the abstract here? What are the themes that come up out of these stories? And then try to boil that down into something that is memorable that people can carry with them. So it's kind of like there are 3 steps here. Number 1 is to come up with, do the brainstorming, the opening it up, finding out what people have to say, the kinds of things that they can imagine. The second one is to look for the themes, and the third is to come up with a simple statement. Any questions about that before I go on? Here is an example. Okay, I talked to a group of about 20 or 30 user experience designers who were working on products for managing other computers. And they started out with kind of big blah things that they were doing, but after one of the fellows after a while said, what I imagine is that because of our software and the way it works, the way it keeps other computers running, that people who are responsible for those systems can go watch their kids' soccer games without having to think about what's going on back at the office. So he's taken something that's a very big general thing. he's put it in terms of imagining somebody being able to watch the kids' soccer games. And then out of that, there is an emotional quality that's not there in a lot of these sort of mission statements that are very, very complicated. So moving from there, we need to make our products easier to use, closer to customer needs. Then moving out, who does this affect? Well, it affects our company, because if we make our products easier to use, they're easier to sell, which makes our salespeople more successful and contributes to the bottom line. But even more, it helps our customers be successful with their contributions to the world. So you can see this sort of widening out picture that comes out of it. So the expression that they came up with was, we keep the world systems running. A very, a simple, not too hard to remember kind of statement. But it went through this three-step process. Okay. So this particular slide is another story. I teach project managers, graduate students in project management at the University of Maryland. I co-teach a class on positive workplaces. And one of the things that we do is explore, well, most of these people are working. Okay, so most of them are taking classes, or either taking a sabbatical from work to go back to school, or are working and going to school. So one day we were talking about purpose, and one young woman said she worked for the sewage plant in Prince George's County, I think, or something like that. And we said, well, what do you feel is the purpose of your work? And she said, well, the purpose of my work is making sure that we meet our contractual deadlines and that we get our reports into the government on time, and that and then she had a list of all these very specific things that they did. And everybody else in the room is looking at her and thinking, you keep the water clean. You keep the sewage from ending up in our rivers. You keep, a system that keeps people from getting diseased. So these are two completely different ways of looking at the same work. And her view was so myopic and specific on what she was responsible for doing that she hadn't actually spread her view apart to see a way of looking at what was the contribution she was making with her work. All right. So how are we doing for time?
We're doing good.
Okay. So I wanted to just take a few minutes, since we're a fairly small group, and just go through a similar kind of process and just sort of see what we might come up with what's our purpose. We are a de facto group, a small group that's come together for a couple of days, maybe an hour here. And what are we doing? What is our purpose in being here? Our shared purpose. Any thoughts?
To learn things that we can bring back to our clients, whether they're individuals and organizations, to make a positive change in the world.
To make a positive change in the world. To learn things to make a positive change in the world. Any stories? Any kind of concrete possibilities?
To find meaning in the job that you are doing, and then spread the enthusiasm.
To find meaning in the job you're doing and spread enthusiasm. Any other ideas?
I think to link with people who have some common values and views about things, sort of to reduce the isolation.
To be connected to other people who are working.
People, that's sort of, for me, that's motivating as well.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
So maybe that sort of sustains me in a way in the work that I'm doing and maintains that enthusiasm for it.
Okay, thank you. Anything from the table over here?
Oh, I think it's very inspiring to come, and I have been to every single one since year 2000. So I came to see old friends and hear new things,
Okay.
Yeah, I heard lots about baby boomers today.
So part of the shared purpose is getting together with other people of like minds. Part of the purpose is to have something to carry back with us to affect the people around. And part of it is to be able to have an impact In other words, I think of it a little bit like dropping pebbles in the water so that we can have this rippling, effect on as we go further out. And then the last question here, is there any ideas about what we could do while we're here to make each other more effective?
Sure, participate, engage.
Participate and engage. Network.
Share.
Okay. And make those connections that then maybe we can draw on as we go back. Right. It's always easier to work with people once you've met them face to face. And so, while you're here, you have a chance to meet all these people face to face that you might otherwise not have a chance to do. I know that from many years working at IBM, where we had lots of virtual meetings with people we'd never met. And sometimes it's just really hard to work with people who are faceless. Okay. So now I'd like to talk a little bit about how people experience meaning differently. This is a picture that comes from an article by Michael Pratt and Blake Ashforth in the book Positive Organizational Scholarship, which is another resource that I've broken the spine. I've used it many times. I've used several of the articles. I think there are about 23 articles by people who are really, phenomenal contributors in the field. What they talk about is that people can experience meaning either in what they do, the specific, I produce this, I do this, this has this effect, or they can experience meaning in the way they affect other people and how they fit into the group and how they make other people more successful, or a combination of the two. Some people are very, very much on this is what I produce, this is where my meaning comes from. Some people are very far over on my being here makes a difference to other people, makes other people more effective. But if you're working with a group of people on meaning, to be aware of the fact that people have both of these ways and that not everybody experiences meaning in the same way, I think can be very useful. This is a slide I've used a lot in the work that I've done over the last few years. Okay? So here is an example. And this is actually, I've talked about sort of a grassroots approach for coming up with a shared purpose. There's also, sometimes the purpose can come sort of handed down by leadership. That's that clear strategic narrative that we talked about earlier. This is an example that came from the brand new dean at the University of California, San Diego, talking to the faculty and staff of the department he was moving into. And he started out by talking about what difference do we make in the world. And he talked about research projects that were contributing to more efficient use of energy, about environmental management, about health, because some of the things that they were doing were going to affect drug development. So all of these, he created these tentacles out into the wider community. Here's the difference that we can make. But then he went on to talk about the fact that everybody in the room was contributing. So you didn't have to be the scientists who were the principal investigators for the research. You could be the receptionist who, answered the telephone and, made connections. You could be the person who made travel arrangements for the scientists who were going to their meetings. You could be the person that kept the lab clean so that the experiments were not affected by poor working conditions. So he drew the line of sight between the work of everybody in the room and these goals so that they could have a sense of it isn't just, I don't have to be the principal investigator to be contributing to this goal that we all share, which is sort of my basic theme today. So how many of you are familiar with Amy Wrzesniewski's work on job, career, and calling? I'm just asking these questions because I don't want to, if everybody says, oh, yes, I've heard about this a million times. Amy Wrzesniewski and some colleagues have looked into the way people experience work. And they've come up with 3 different ways that people experience their work. There's the job approach, which is, I go to work because I get paid. And basically, my work supports my interests in other parts of my life. Okay? Then there's the career orientation, which is I go to work because I am climbing the career ladder and I want to get ahead. I want status. I want to be recognized. I want people to know who I am. It's important to me to be climbing up the ladder. And then there are people who experience work as a calling, which is a sense of this work, I am doing it because it draws something deep from me. It makes me feel that I'm contributing. I do the work because I love doing the work. Now, one of the things they found is that people at every level of a hierarchy can have any of these three orientations. It's not like the people at the top have one and the people at the bottom have another. At every level, people have the same orientations. And this is a question that really stumped my graduate students when I asked them, any job, I actually asked, which orientation is a doctor most likely to have? And they all thought, calling. Well, it turns out, no. Doctors, lawyers, any profession, they're just about as likely, about a third, people are to have each one of these different orientations to work. Now, so sometimes people look at this and say, oh, clearly you want everybody to have a calling orientation, but there actually are, there are good things about having people with a career orientation because they tend to do the kinds of jobs that nobody else would do because it helps them get visibility and it helps them rise up the ladder. But it does make a difference. And this is from the article that Amy Wrzesniewski published in the Positive Organizational Scholarship book, where she basically said if the majority of people in your work group have a calling orientation, then the overall team, the way the whole team works will be affected. There'll be a stronger identification with the team. There'll be less conflict. People will be more committed. You'll have healthier processes, all of these benefits. If the majority of the people on your team have a career orientation, you'll have weaker identification with the team, weaker more, basically lower. So in other words, the predominant orientation on your team affects the quality of the work experience of everybody on the team. So if you happen to have a career orientation, but you're actually on a team that is mostly people with a calling orientation, you will have a better experience than the other way around. So this is one of my arguments for saying that spending time helping people understand the calling of their work, the purpose, to own the work and feel that a direct connection to it has a business value, and it affects the way teams work. Okay, we're getting close to the end. One of the things that I work on a lot is motivation. Okay, I work with groups of people to help them understand how motivation works, and I help people think about different ways that they can change things to make it more likely that people are motivated to do work. And one of the things I try and help people understand is you're not going to have the same level of motivation for everything that's on your list to do. You're not going to, and some things you'll be, in fact, I actually went through wrote an article where I analyzed about the things that I was doing and could show that I had about 5 different levels of motivation for the work that I was doing. But you can have an overarching level of motivation. If you're not happy with that level of motivation, I have a tool that I use that is a set of 16 questions that people can use for analyzing where am I with respect to motivation. And these questions suggest actions that you can take to make it more likely that your motivation goes up. Now, these questions are based on the Dietschy and Ryan work on self-determination theory, where they tie motivation to competence. People have a basic need to feel competent. Relatedness, people have a basic need to be connected with other people and to be recognized by other people. Autonomy, once people are competent, they have a basic need to be able to have self-control over what they do. And I've added to this meaning, because they make the statement in one of their major papers that you have to believe that what you're doing is worth doing in the first place to be motivated intrinsically to do it. And that, I believe, ties into meaning. So these are the 4 questions that I've put together for meaning. These are questions that you can ask people. For example, if you could use these as a supervisor talking to an employee, or you could use these yourself if you're thinking about your job and you're thinking, boy, I sure am not feeling very motivated. You can use these questions to sort of figure out, is it a competence issue? Is it a relatedness issue? Is it an autonomy issue? Is it a meaningfulness issue? Or a little bit of each. And as you can see, each one of these questions, there are suggested actions for working on it. So do you understand the goals of your company? And if not, you can start working on this simple shared purpose statement that people can remember, that people can buy into. Do they believe in the company goal? I mean, if sometimes people find that it's like my daughter, and oops, I wasn't supposed to say it was my daughter, but anyway, like my daughter at the barista who felt like she was pushing calories on people. She was at odds with the purpose of the company, which was to sell people more and more, fancy drinks, and she was looking at it with all that whipped cream and all that sugar. So she was at odds with the value. In her case, she was in the wrong place. Sometimes that's whether, sometimes if you're at odds with the purpose of your company. And then finally, to think about whether or not, if you've got somebody who's very, very much experiences meaning by making other people successful, but they're off working on their own without having that opportunity, are there ways that you could recraft the job to make it so that they got more of that experience in terms of what they're doing? So, how am I doing for time?
Got about 10 minutes, and then we've got 10 minutes for discussion.
Okay, terrific. This particular picture or matrix here comes from work by a man named Isaac Perlotensky, who makes the point, and he was actually looking at the whole area of therapy and social services, and he makes the point that most of the time we put our focus on working with individuals and on reacting to what's wrong. So that's this bottom corner over here. And his point is that we would go a lot further with our energy and with our time and all of our resources if instead we focused on the group, the community, the organization, and we were proactive. In other words, we were looking at what are the positive things that are going there? How can we build on the strengths? So, everybody's going to be hearing Diana Whitney talk about appreciative inquiry. The part of what appreciative inquiry brings is this focus on what's the best of what is and the best of what has been. Well, I've got a list. I've got a whole set of interventions that can be used with organizations, and I fit them into these 4 quadrants. And when I showed this in my dry run, people said, there's just way too much information here. So I pulled out 2 that are associated with purpose, and make the point that I think that if you think about purpose as a shared entity, as something that people in a group have, as opposed to what individuals have, that you can be working in this quadrant where you can make the most difference. And why don't you use the drips, the dropping pebbles in the water, and that this is a way of making a difference. So, before I get into the takeaways myself, what are you going to carry away from this discussion today?
So one of the things I'm really curious about is this thing around, you said the Amy Wrzesniewski, and I want to get still in her name, is this thing around job, career, and calling, and how the predominant experience of people on the team or a group is going to kind of impact the whole system, which would kind of make sense. So that, for example, I do a lot of work with healthcare, and nurses who, especially people that are working in seniors housing, they are doing the work because it's meaningful, and yet they get burnt out and tired. So then what happens? It becomes probably, it's not a calling anymore, it's a job.
It's a job.
So I'm curious about that. So that was fascinating to me. So that's one of the things I'm
Okay.
doing.
All right.
Thanks.
And you know, one of the famous examples of a difference between a job and a calling, or people cleaning rooms in a hospital. And there's a story about one person who's, you know, as they clean rooms, they're thinking about, I am making this environment, I'm part of making it possible for this person to get well. It's a very demanding job. You know, it's hard to maintain that kind of approach, but it might be that sometimes people need to go back to the meaning well and let the day-to-day sort of absorption of little things be somewhat washed away by the importance of what they're doing. What else?
Kathryn, I find there's many things for me to take away from this, and articles and things I plan to look up and learn more about. One piece that you were just speaking about on the previous slide that just stood out as another place for me. Yeah, I was just thinking about the idea about shared purpose and the whole idea about the role that the culture plays, either within an organization, within a profession, within a society, around individualistic versus collectivist perspectives. And when you were talking earlier about the career advancement idea, that really is one example of almost the epitome of the individualistic pursuits of things, which there's a lot of support for. And I can see that the competitive aspect, the challenge that can bring around shared purpose, the collective purpose, that's not always a dominant valued perspective, that it often will come back to individualistic pieces.
Right.
And at least in some areas of work. And I was just curious if you had any thoughts about how to work with that in your experience, what that's been like.
Well, when I first worked for IBM, for some reason this is what popped into my mind as you were talking. When I first worked for IBM, it was not uncommon to have 2 or 3 projects launched to do the same thing. IBM, I worked for IBM for a long time, so when I first got there, they were a lot more dominant than they are now. And the idea was you had to have competition in order to have new ideas come about. And somewhere, you know, after Microsoft came along, people started realizing, you know, we don't need internal competition. We've got plenty of external competition. So I think part of it is there are some people who are driven by competition. That's what they need in order to get up out of bed and get going. And that's, you know, there are a lot of different kinds of people. But I think that and now I'm in the realms of speculation here, so just wave a flag and say I can't give you data to support this. But I suspect that there are a lot of people who are not driven by competition, find it actually turns them off a little bit, and would prefer to have something that is more collaborative as a day-to-day purpose for going to work. But once again, I just know that the people, for example, who want to shout, kill Microsoft at IBM are louder than the people that find that to be totally off-putting. That's sort of a wandering in the woods kind of answer, but.
It was a wandering in the woods comment and question.
Okay.
I enjoyed the walk in the woods.
Okay. Go ahead.
In terms of how that balance might be achieved, I just heard of the research yesterday that the highly successful teams have a balance between internal and external focus. I focus on the external competition, which I already know really reduces workplace politics, but the low functioning teams they are just completely off the charts in terms of the imbalance. They're just completely focused on the petty. And so all the stuff I know on the end of politics takes that into account. That if you have that external purpose that unites everybody, it keeps all that pettiness down to a minimum and it keeps it in balance. You still take care of the internal, but it's not your focus.
Right. It sounds like you're pointing to the work of Marshall Lasada.
Yes, yes, that's who it is.
And he has 3 ratios that represent differences between high, medium, and low performing work teams. And one of the ratios is the ratio of positive to negative utterances. So they actually watched 60 teams or so and counted how many negative things were said, how many positive things were said. And they found that high performing teams tended to have like a 5-to-1 ratio, and low performing teams it was like 0.7 to 1. So I never really quite figured out how you use this, because I've never been able to get behind a one-way glass and watch people in a meeting and count positive and negatives, or get people to agree to do this counting. But I think that Lasada actually does have a way of doing that. The other 2 ratios are advocacy versus inquiry. So if you're having a conversation, you're having a meeting, are people mostly paying attention to what they have to say themselves and how to get that across, or are they actually asking questions and trying to hear from the other point of view? And that tends to be, in the really high-performing teams, tends to be a 1-to-1. It's a close balance. And then finally, the other, us versus other focus tends to be an even balance in the high-performing teams. There's a couple of short articles that Lasada wrote for Positive Psychology News Daily that are a really good, quick introduction to these ratios if you don't want to read the actual paper. So
cold to Newcastle.
Yeah, but it's a great point that you're bringing up. That's really, it's interesting work. Anything from this table?
Well, just listening to you talk about callings, my experience with people who are deeply involved in their calling is that they give themselves away totally to it and can get burnt out. That rather than those who just have a career, and I'm probably one of those examples where, I really feel called to what I do, and I have to be really mindful of not giving my whole life to it, in a sense of really managing my own sensibility of my life in what I call my calling.
Right. You're connecting with the point that she was just making, and I think that there's a lot to that. And part of it is, I told you that I've had jobs where I woke up at 3 o'clock in the morning and I have to really force myself to stay in bed because I'm so anxious to get back to what I was doing. That, you do have to get people to think about how to manage their energy. I mean, I told you there were 4 questions that I had for groups. One of them is, do you have a shared and valued purpose? One is, how do you manage the energy of your people? And one of the questions in that one is, do you have a plan, a way of dealing with people for perceiving burnout and of getting people to do the things they need to do in order to refill the well? You can't run marathons continuously every single day. It just, the human body's not built that way.
Yeah. Right.
Yes.
Yes, in terms of self-determination theory, do you then start with the individual level first or team, or is there a sequence to purpose and calling in your work? Do you do...
Well, with the self-determination theory, the little tool that I showed you here is kind of it's kind of an individual tool. It's sort of like you go in to have a discussion with your manager and you're feeling kind of low on motivation, or you're the manager and you're talking to somebody and you feel you're sort of low on motivation. It's a way of exploring that. But when it comes to the question of, do you experience meaning at work, the answer to that is a group answer. So if you're not feeling meaning at work, you might not be the only one. So it might be that there's some attention needed across the board. So I am out of time, and I really do need to let the other ladies...
We have 5 minutes.
Oh, 5 minutes, okay.
If you're finished, we would have 5 minutes to dialogue.
So one last question, because I want to let the other ladies have time to pursue what they're doing. Okay. Thank you. Oh, I do have one last point. And by the way, my teams it used to be a joke on my teams that I had status meetings every week, but I always had to have the last word. So I'm just going to have the last word here. That out in the book area, we have I write for Positive Psychology News Daily, and we have a little book called Resilience: How to Navigate Life's Curves, which is based on articles that were published there. If you happen to pick up a copy, I'd be happy to sign it. So I just thought I'd let you know that.